What if the answer to our energy crisis has been buried, not because it failed, but because it worked too well? Imagine a world where electricity is so abundant, so clean, and so cheap, it's nearly free. A world where heat flows into homes without fuel, where water condenses from the air for drinking, and cars hum quietly on long drives without a drop of gasoline. It's not science fiction. These were real technologies, proven, tested, in some cases used for decades, and then silenced. This story begins not with a conspiracy, but with a pattern of innovation meeting resistance. Not because the ideas were flawed, but because they were too efficient, too independent, too disruptive to industries built on control. From the windswept plains of Idaho to the echoing halls of Congress, from buried reactors to crushed electric vehicles, a quiet war has unfolded. Not over resources, but over access. This is a story of inventions that worked so well they became threats. Threats not to safety, but to profits, to monopolies, to the idea that energy must always come with a price. In the 1980s, a new type of nuclear reactor passed every safety test scientists could throw at it. When cooling systems were shut off at full power, it didn't melt down. It shut itself down. It devoured its own waste, solved the storage crisis, and used fuel the U.S. had in surplus for 700 years. This was the integral fast reactor. By 1994, it was ready for a commercial debut. Instead, it was dismantled, its funding slashed. The official reason? Budget cuts. The unofficial one? It threatened billion-dollar industries that rely on fuel, enrichment, and waste management. This was not an isolated case. In Boise, Idaho, a city heated itself with water pulled from underground. No combustion, no emissions, just pipes and warmth. It worked flawlessly for over a century, but utilities couldn't profit from free heat. So expansion was stifled by regulations, insurance hurdles, and financing barriers. Today, it still heats a few buildings, but not the city it could. In the desert, machines pulled drinking water from humid air. In the city, electric cars zipped quietly down streets without oil changes or gas bills. On coastlines, tides rose and fell with clockwork precision, generating power without pause. All these technologies worked. All promised a future of energy abundance. All were shut down, restricted, or abandoned, not because they failed, but because they threatened the systems that profit from scarcity. Even in the early 1900s, Tesla's dream of broadcasting power wirelessly to the globe was halted. Not for lack of science, but because financiers realized they couldn't meter the current. This series will explore 10 technologies, real, functional, and often forgotten, that offered too much. Each part will dive into one of these innovations, beginning with a vivid image, unspooling the facts, the context, the cultural resistance. Each will end not in outrage, but in reflection. Because at its heart, this isn't just a story about energy. It's about memory, about how we choose what to remember and what to bury. It's about the future we could have had and still might. So let's begin where the silence started. In a lab where scientists turned off a reactor's cooling system and watched in awe as nothing exploded. A moment when the impossible was made real and then erased. It started with an experiment no one believed would succeed. In 1986, deep within Argonne National Laboratory, scientists did something radical. They turned off every cooling system on a nuclear reactor while it was running at full power. In the shadow of Chernobyl's fresh scars, this would seem reckless, even suicidal. But the reactor didn't melt down. It didn't overheat. It simply stopped, silently, safely. The laws of physics, not wires or computers, brought it to a halt. This was the integral fast reactor, an advanced nuclear design decades ahead of its time. It used liquid sodium instead of water to cool its core. Unlike water, sodium doesn't boil at reactor temperatures. eliminating the main cause of meltdowns. The reactor's fuel wasn't the usual ceramic, but a metallic alloy. That choice wasn't arbitrary. It allowed the reactor to recycle its own waste through a process called pyroprocessing. In short, it could eat its own garbage. It was a self-regulating machine. No need for complex safety systems or human intervention. Failures triggered physical responses. Metal expanded, reactions slowed, heat dispersed. It was like building a car that brakes automatically when the road disappears. No system like it had existed before. And the advantages didn't stop at safety. The IFR could run on nuclear waste, the stockpiles that had haunted policymakers for decades. It could even breed new fuel from depleted uranium, of which the U.S. had more than 700,000 tons in storage. Enough to power the nation for centuries without mining a single new ounce. After 10 years of research, testing, and validation, the reactor stood ready in 1994 for commercial demonstration. The technology was proven, the data was solid, the potential was enormous. All that remained was scaling it up. But Congress pulled the plug. The official line was budget cuts, but inside closed rooms, the truth was clearer. The IFR threatened too many bottom lines. Uranium enrichment, waste storage, fuel fabrication. Industries worth billions stood to lose everything. More critically, fossil fuel companies saw danger. A reactor that couldn't melt down, didn't need constant fuel shipments, and cost little to operate, was a nightmare for a profit model built on consumption. And so the project died. The reactor was dismantled, the team disbanded, the data archived in obscurity. Not because the IFR failed, but because it succeeded too well. It's easy to romanticize what might have been. A nation powered by reactors immune to catastrophe. Electricity so cheap it didn't need metering. Nuclear waste reduced to a memory. But this isn't fantasy. The IFR existed. It worked. It was stopped not by science, but by economics. We often think of technological progress as inevitable, as marching forward. But sometimes progress is quietly erased, not with explosions, but with silence. What happens when a solution to our most pressing problems doesn't align with someone else's profits? What future do we lose? Not to failure, but to success. The story of the integral fast reactor forces us to confront a haunting question. What if the safest nuclear reactor in history was dismantled, not because it was dangerous, but because it wasn't? Beneath the streets of Boise, Idaho, hot water has flowed for over a century, quiet, constant, and nearly free. In 1890, when most of the country still relied on coal and wood for warmth, Boise tapped into something deeper. Literally, beneath the city lies a vast geothermal aquifer, naturally heated by the Earth's internal processes. That year, the Warm Springs Water District began piping 170-degree water into homes, businesses, and government buildings. No furnaces, no combustion. Just warm water rising through the earth and circulating through a growing network of pipes. By the 1920s, hundreds of buildings were heated this way. The state capitol, downtown offices, hotels, homes, entire blocks kept comfortable through a system that required no fuel and produced no emissions. After the infrastructure was installed, the heat was essentially free. But therein lay the problem. Electric utilities and gas companies couldn't sell what people no longer needed. Geothermal heat couldn't be metered like electricity or natural gas. Once your pipes were in, you stopped paying. And for businesses built on recurring bills, that was a threat too dangerous to ignore. Slowly, quietly, the resistance grew. Utilities promoted electric and gas heat as modern alternatives. Advertisements painted geothermal as outdated, old-fashioned. Building codes began requiring electric or gas hookups even when geothermal was available. Banks declined loans for projects without conventional heating systems. Insurance premiums rose. Regulations tightened. By the 1970s, Despite Boise's growing population, the number of buildings using geothermal heat had declined from its peak half a century earlier. The system wasn't broken. It had always worked. The barriers were external, artificial, imposed not because geothermal failed, but because it didn't generate profit. Then something shifted. In the 1980s, amid energy crises and environmental concern, the system was revived. The city modernized its geothermal infrastructure. Today, about 100 buildings, including the state capitol, are still heated this way. The water still flows, still warm, still clean. But it could do so much more. The geothermal resource beneath Boise could heat every home in the city. The energy is already there. No mining, no combustion, no climate impact. The only thing missing is permission. Expanding the system makes economic sense. The infrastructure costs would pay for themselves in a few years just from savings on heating bills. But the growth remains stunted, not by physics, not by feasibility, but by a business model that can't profit from heat that costs nothing to produce. We often ask why clean energy isn't more widespread, but sometimes the answer isn't technical or scientific. Sometimes it's simple. If you can't sell it, you bury it. Boise's underground heat offers more than just warmth. It offers a lesson. That good ideas don't always rise to the surface. That cheap, sustainable energy can be suppressed not by failure, but by success. What else lies beneath us? Working perfectly, waiting to expand, but kept small because its price tag reads, free? In the humid heat of the American South, an idea once shimmered in the air. Literally. The concept was simple: pull water from the atmosphere. In the 1930s, inventors developed machines that did just that: atmospheric water generators. They cooled air below its dew point, causing moisture to condense into drinkable water. No pipes, no wells, just humidity drawn down from the sky. By the 1970s, the technology had improved. In tropical and coastal regions, small units could produce hundreds of gallons per day. The only cost? Electricity to run the system. And in areas where water bills were high or supplies uncertain, this changed everything. Suddenly, homes and businesses could access fresh water without paying utility companies. A new form of independence seemed possible. But independence has a price, for someone. Water utilities saw their revenue streams at risk. If people could generate water from the air, why stay connected to the municipal system? How do you charge for water that doesn't flow through your pipes? So the pushback began. Regulations were introduced in surprising ways. In some states, atmospheric water generators were reclassified as wells, requiring expensive permits and geological assessments. In others, the water was labeled gray water, not safe to drink without additional treatment, despite being nearly identical to distilled water. Building codes began requiring municipal water hookups, even if a property generated its own supply. You couldn't get an occupancy permit without signing up for city water service. And with that came the connection fees, base rates, and monthly minimums, bills for water you might never use. Incredibly, some Western states equated atmospheric water collection with rainwater harvesting and declared it illegal. The argument? That water vapor in the air belonged to downstream users under existing water rights law. Condensing it, they claimed, was a form of theft. It sounds absurd, because it is. Yet the effect was real. The machines remained available, but their adoption stalled. In the very places where they made the most sense, hot, humid regions with scarce water, they were hardest to use. Permitting hurdles, classification battles, zoning restrictions. The barriers mounted, not because the technology failed, but because it bypassed the gatekeepers. Today, atmospheric water generators exist mostly on the fringes, in off-grid homes, disaster zones, or niche markets. But the vision remains powerful: clean water pulled from the sky, wherever and whenever it's needed. A lifeline in drought, a shield against contamination, a quiet rebuke to the idea that basic needs must come with a monthly bill. This isn't just about water. It's about control, about what happens when technology frees us from dependence, and who gets to decide whether that's allowed. When you breathe in humid air, you're inhaling the potential for something radical, water without pipes, bills, or scarcity. The question is, why aren't we drinking it? And what else, right now, floats just out of reach, not because we can't grasp it, but because someone made sure we wouldn't try? It began with a whisper, not a roar, the smooth hum of an electric motor gliding down a California road. In 1996, General Motors introduced the EV1, a sleek, futuristic car that didn't need gasoline. It was quiet, fast, and elegant. With a range of over 80 miles per charge, it covered the daily needs of most drivers. Charging happened overnight in your garage. No tailpipes, no oil changes, no gas stations, and people loved it. GM leased about 1,000 of these cars, mostly in California and Arizona. Drivers reported satisfaction rates above 90%. The vehicles were low maintenance. Regenerative braking extended the life of brake pads. No exhaust systems, no engine repairs. Owners saved thousands each year in fuel and service costs. This wasn't a concept. It was a revolution already in motion, but not everyone was celebrating. The auto industry makes significant profit not from car sales, but from maintenance, oil changes, transmission repairs, exhaust replacements. The EV1 needed almost none of it, and for oil companies, the danger was existential. One EV1 could save 500 gallons of gasoline per year. Multiply that by millions of vehicles, and you begin to see the scope of the disruption. Despite growing demand, GM pulled the plug. In 2003, they recalled every single EV1. Even as drivers begged to buy their leased vehicles, GM refused. The cars were not sold. They were destroyed, crushed under steel jaws, erased from the road. Officially, GM said there was no market. But that wasn't true. There were waiting lists, protests, letters, owners who wept as their cars were hauled away. The reality was more uncomfortable. The EV1 worked too well. Behind the scenes, GM had sold the patent for the car's advanced nickel-metal hydride batteries to Chevron. Soon after, those batteries were locked away, prohibited from use in large-scale electric vehicles. For nearly a decade, the industry fell silent. No major automaker offered an electric car in the United States. Tesla eventually broke that silence, but the delay cost us years of cleaner air, lower emissions, and lower costs. Years lost not to technical failure, but to economic fear. The EV1 wasn't just a car, it was a glimpse of a different kind of future. One not powered by oil, not dependent on service departments or gas pumps. A future where mobility was cleaner, cheaper, and simpler. But simplicity is dangerous to those who profit from complexity. What does it say about us that a car designed to free us from fossil fuels had to be crushed? That working technology was buried because it shifted the balance of power? The story of the EV1 leaves us with more than memories. It leaves us with a question that hums beneath the surface of every innovation. What if the greatest threats to progress are not our limitations, but our unwillingness to let go of what we profit from the most? In a quiet corner of Oak Ridge National Laboratory in the 1960s, a different kind of nuclear reactor quietly came to life. It didn't use high-pressure water. It couldn't explode. It couldn't melt down. It didn't even run on uranium. It ran on thorium. The molten salt reactor experiment was a small test bed, just a few megawatts, but what it represented was immense. Instead of solid fuel rods, it used a liquid mixture of thorium salts. The result was extraordinary. If the system overheated, a freeze plug would melt, and the fuel would drain into a safety tank. No intervention needed. It operated at atmospheric pressure, removing the risk of explosions. It produced far less waste, waste that remained dangerous for centuries, not millennia. And thorium itself was 3 to 4 times more abundant than uranium. It was elegant, simple, safer, and it worked. Over 4 years of operation, the thorium reactor proved stable, clean, and efficient. Engineers saw a future where nuclear power could be smaller, cheaper, and far less dangerous. But then, just as momentum built, the program was shut down. Why? Because thorium couldn't produce weapons-grade material. The United States nuclear infrastructure was deeply intertwined with the military. The dominant reactor design, the light water reactor, was chosen not because it was the safest or most efficient, but because it aligned with weapons production. Light water reactors used enriched uranium and produced plutonium as a byproduct, perfect for making bombs. Thorium couldn't do that. It was peaceful by nature, and that made it expendable. Despite its superior safety, lower waste, and abundant fuel, the thorium reactor disappeared. Its team was disbanded, its technology shelved, its promise ignored. Decades later, countries like India and China began revisiting thorium. They saw its potential, not just as an energy source, but as a path to clean independence. But in the U.S., investment remained minimal. The infrastructure, the training, the political will, it had all been built around uranium. Around dual use, energy and weapons. Thorium didn't fit that model, so it was left behind. This is the story of a technology that dared to be safe. That offered power without fear, abundance without risk, and for that it was abandoned. What if our energy systems weren't chosen for what they provide, but for what they support? What else have we lost because a peaceful future didn't serve a strategic present? The thorium reactor stands as a monument to what could have been. A clean, safe, abundant energy source, sidelined not for failing, but for refusing to play the game of war. And the silence that followed wasn't technical, it was political. In 1941, Henry Ford unveiled a car like no other. It ran not on gasoline, but on fuel made from plants. Its body was partially constructed from hemp fiber. Stronger than steel, lighter than metal, and powered by a crop that could be grown just about anywhere. This was not just a new car, it was a challenge to the entire petroleum economy. Hemp, the non-psychoactive cousin of marijuana, was a miracle crop. It grew fast, required little water or fertilizer, and thrived in poor soil. As a fuel source, it was unmatched. It could be refined into ethanol or biodiesel. It produced more ethanol per acre than corn. Its emissions were cleaner, and its energy return was positive, meaning it gave back more energy than it took to grow and process. Unlike petroleum, which required drilling, refining, and distribution infrastructure, hemp could be grown by farmers and turned into fuel locally. That alone was a revolution. But not everyone saw it that way. The oil industry saw competition. The synthetic fiber industry, spearheaded by companies like DuPont, feared hemp's strong natural fiber would replace nylons and plastics made from oil. The timber and paper industries viewed hemp as a threat too. It produced more paper per acre than trees and didn't require clear-cutting forests. So they acted. In 1937, the U.S. passed the Marijuana Tax Act, effectively criminalizing all forms of cannabis, including industrial hemp. Though hemp contained negligible THC, it was swept up in a tide of fear and propaganda. Newspapers owned by powerful industrialists ran headlines demonizing cannabis, blending industrial hemp with its psychoactive relatives in the public's mind. The drug angle was a smokescreen. The real goal was economic control. And it worked. For over 80 years, hemp remained banned in the United States. The infrastructure to process hemp into fuel, fiber, and paper vanished. Generations forgot what the crop could do. When it was finally legalized in 2018, the damage had already been done. Petroleum was entrenched. Hemp was a historical footnote, yet the science never changed. Hemp still grows fast, clean and strong. It still produces superior biofuel. It still holds the promise of decentralized energy, of farms becoming fuel stations, of communities powering themselves from soil, sun, and seed. But reviving that vision would mean rebuilding everything the fossil fuel industry has spent decades constructing and defending. The story of hemp fuel isn't just about a crop. It's about control, about how something abundant and sustainable can be framed as dangerous if it threatens the wrong interests. We often think of history as a march of progress, but sometimes it's a loop. An idea is born, buried, and later rediscovered, worn but alive. So we must ask, how many revolutions have been planted only to be uprooted before they could grow? And what would our world look like if we had been allowed to fuel it from the fields instead of the ground? On the French coast of Brittany, the tides have moved with unwavering rhythm for thousands of years. In 1966, engineers at the Rance River estuary harnessed that rhythm. They built a tidal power station, one of the first of its kind, where the ocean's movement turned massive turbines, generating electricity every day as predictably as the sunrise. It still runs today, over half a century later. Quiet, clean, consistent. Tidal power is unique among renewables. Unlike the sun and wind, tides are perfectly predictable. We know the moon's path for centuries to come. There is no guesswork, no intermittency, just the gravity of the moon and the sea's endless pulse. The technology is proven. South Korea, Canada, and the UK have built successful tidal installations. The Bay of Fundy alone could power much of eastern Canada. The UK's tidal potential could meet half its electricity needs. These aren't wild projections. They're measurable, calculable, real. Yet tidal power remains a footnote in global energy discussions. Why? Because once built, tidal plants require little ongoing input, no fuel, minimal maintenance, no sprawling networks of suppliers. They produce electricity for decades with little dependency on external systems. And that independence is unsettling to those whose profits depend on selling fuel and metering consumption. Utilities thrive on volatility, on monthly bills, on fuel charges, on grid fluctuations that justify complex pricing models. But a tidal plant quietly generating local electricity for 50 years, it breaks the model. So the barriers rise, permits take years. Environmental reviews scrutinize marine impacts, even though existing tidal plants show minimal disruption to sea life. Fishing industries protest, despite coexistence proving viable. Most telling, proposed tidal projects are often blocked outright, not because they don't work, but because they'd work too well. The UK once considered the Severn Estuary Barrage, a project that could have delivered 5% of the nation's electricity from tidal flow alone. Technically sound, economically feasible. It was shelved permanently. Why build something that could power generations when you can sell fuel every month instead? The ocean doesn't send invoices. It doesn't raise prices. It doesn't care about quarterly earnings. That's the problem. Tidal energy reminds us that nature already provides abundance, that predictable power is possible, that energy need not always be transactional. It also reminds us of a deeper truth, that sometimes the most sustainable ideas are drowned, not by the sea, but by the systems we've built to control it. What other forces, steady and silent, have we ignored simply because they can't be owned? And if we could learn to listen to the tides, not just the water, but the shifts in power, what future might come ashore? It rose like a dream from the sand dunes of Long Island, a tower built to whisper electricity through the air. In 1901, Nikola Tesla began construction on the Wardenclyffe Tower. At 187 feet tall, crowned with a metal dome and anchored by iron roots driven deep into the earth, it looked more like a sculpture than a power plant. But Tesla wasn't building for beauty. He believed he could transmit electricity wirelessly across continents through the atmosphere, using the Earth itself as a conductor. The idea sounds impossible, yet Tesla had already demonstrated wireless power transmission on small scales. In Colorado Springs, he lit lamps from afar without wires. Wardenclyffe was the next step, global broadcast of power. No cables, no poles, no power lines. Tesla's plan was to generate electricity at the tower and send it through the ground and air. Anyone, anywhere, with the right receiver could tap into the energy. Unlimited, unmetered, universal. At first, Tesla had funding. J.P. Morgan, one of the most powerful financiers of the time, backed the project. But when Tesla revealed the full scope, that the electricity would be free and globally accessible, Morgan withdrew his support. The reason was simple. You can't meter wireless power. You can't charge per kilowatt if you can't control the flow. If anyone could receive energy without paying, how would the system profit? Without funding, the tower stalled. Tesla's vision remained unfinished. In 1917, the Wardenclyffe Tower was demolished for scrap. Tesla died in obscurity, his papers scattered, his ideas whispered about for decades. Did it work? No one knows for certain. The project was shut down before it could be completed. Modern physicists debate the feasibility of Tesla's system. But here's the more important point. The project wasn't stopped because it didn't work. It was stopped because it might have. What if power could be shared like air or sunlight? What if energy could flow across borders and walls, indifferent to ownership? Tesla's dream wasn't just technical, it was philosophical. It challenged the very notion of control, of who gets to decide who has power, literally. In a world where energy is currency, a system that gives it away freely is a threat. Not to safety, not to science, but to structure. We remember Tesla now as a genius, but often forget how threatening his ideas were to those who profited from scarcity. The Wardenclyffe Tower stands, if only in memory, as a symbol of what we dared not allow. If energy could be free, what else might follow? And what futures have we quietly dismantled, not because they couldn't work, but because they wouldn't pay? It began with sunlight on an empty patch of land, and a simple idea. What if a group of neighbors could share the sun? Community solar gardens were born from that question. Instead of installing panels on individual rooftops, people could buy into a shared solar array built on open ground. In return, they'd receive credits on their electricity bills for the power it produced. Clean, predictable energy. No roof required. The benefits were immediate. Solar gardens used ideal sites, sunny, flat, unobstructed, and achieved economies of scale that made them cheaper than rooftop systems. They were professionally maintained, eliminating the burden for homeowners. Renters, people with shaded homes, and those unable to afford full installations could now access solar energy. It worked exceptionally well. States like Minnesota, Colorado, and Massachusetts saw an explosion of community solar between 2015 and 2017. Thousands of households signed up. Electricity bills dropped by 20 to 30%. Participants locked in rates for decades, shielded from the volatility of utility pricing. But then, regulations changed. Utilities, facing shrinking revenue, moved quickly. They lobbied for new fees, demand charges, standby fees, grid access costs designed to erode solar savings. Net metering policies were weakened or removed entirely. States imposed caps, limiting community solar to a tiny fraction of total capacity. Permitting processes grew slower, more complex, more expensive. The message was clear: scale was not welcome. In theory, utilities welcomed renewable energy. In practice, they opposed anything that gave customers control. If too many people generated their own power, Even collectively, it would disrupt the business model built on centralized generation and consumption. The grid itself became a weapon. Solar garden participants still use the grid to distribute their power, and utilities used that connection to justify new charges. In some cases, customers were forced to pay for infrastructure they no longer needed. In others, interconnection delays stretched into years, quietly killing projects before they could begin. It wasn't about reliability. The solar gardens worked. It wasn't about fairness. The savings were real. It was about control. Community solar offered a glimpse of something powerful: energy democracy, a model where people could choose how their power was generated and who profited. A model that blurred the line between consumer and producer, and for that it was slowed, capped, and smothered. Today, community solar still exists, but in limited form. It's not the failure of the idea. It's the success that made it dangerous. We often hear that energy freedom lies in personal solar panels, in self-reliance. But the deeper revolution may be shared. Not everyone can install panels, but everyone can be part of something larger. What if power, both electrical and social, could come from community? And what would it take to build a grid that empowers rather than controls? High in the hills, beside rivers and streams, a different kind of energy once flowed, small, steady, and free. Between 1900 and 1940, thousands of small-scale hydroelectric dams dotted the American landscape. These weren't massive Hoover-like structures. They were modest installations, dams powering local mills, farms, and towns with clean electricity from flowing water. A stream became a power plant. A hillside became independence. The technology was simple: divert part of a stream through a turbine. Generate power, return the water downstream. No fuel, no pollution, and minimal upkeep. For rural communities, it was transformative. Electricity arrived where utility lines hadn't. Some facilities ran reliably for decades, paid off, maintained locally, and quietly delivering power without outside help. But over time, independence became a liability. As utility companies expanded their reach, they saw small hydro as competition. These local sources weren't profitable, at least not for the centralized model. So a slow regulatory strangulation began. Permitting requirements multiplied. Federal oversight was extended even to tiny installations. Environmental impact studies were mandated. Fish passage systems, often costing more than the dam itself, were required, even on streams with no measurable fish population. Liability insurance became prohibitively expensive, and compensation for feeding electricity into the grid was set far below market value. A farmer producing a few $1,000s in electricity annually might face $200,000 in upgrades and permits just to continue operating a system that had worked flawlessly for 50 years. The economics collapsed by design. By 1980, most small hydro installations were shut down, not because they were unsafe, not because they polluted, but because they couldn't survive the financial and bureaucratic burden. The irony was painful. At the exact moment the country began seeking renewable energy solutions, it had already abandoned one of its best. A system that worked. That empowered communities. That proved energy didn't have to be distant or expensive. Today, a few of these sites have been restored. Some are recognized as historical landmarks, but the barriers remain. Starting a new small hydro project involves years of permitting and hundreds of thousands of dollars in compliance costs, regardless of size or impact. This wasn't about protecting rivers. It was about protecting revenue. Because if people can generate their own electricity from a stream, why buy it from a utility? If a town can power itself for free, what happens to the business model? The fall of small hydro tells a story we've heard before, that what works quietly, locally, and freely is often the most vulnerable, not to failure, but to indifference, or worse, intentional suppression. We talk of building a green future, but maybe we had one, and let it be dismantled. How many rivers still run untapped, not because they can't power us, but because we're not allowed to let them? And if we once lit our homes from mountain streams, could we do it again if we dared to let go of permission and rediscover what we already knew? It was a paradox hiding in plain sight, a reactor that solved nearly every problem with nuclear energy, and yet was dismantled. The integral fast reactor, geothermal heat in Boise, atmospheric water from air, electric cars that required no gas, thorium reactors that couldn't melt down, fuel from hemp, energy from the tides, Tesla's broadcast tower, solar gardens shared by neighbors, and hydropower from backyard streams. Each of these technologies had something in common. They worked. Each one passed tests, showed results, met needs. Each one proved it could deliver cheaper, cleaner, more independent access to power, heat, or water. And each one was blocked, buried, banned, or bought out. Why? Because they didn't just solve technical problems, they disrupted economic ones. Too many of these systems made energy too cheap. They removed the need for ongoing payments, fuel shipments, proprietary maintenance, or centralized control. They turned consumers into participants. And for an industry structured around scarcity and billing cycles, that wasn't innovation. It was danger. In a different kind of world, we would have built forward from these breakthroughs, scaled them, adapted them, made them better. But instead, we dismantled working prototypes, disbanded research teams, criminalized crops, crushed cars, and wrapped red tape around anything that hinted at autonomy. Not because the science was flawed, but because the business model was. Look closer, and a pattern emerges. A reactor that eats its own waste threatens the waste disposal industry. A car that never visits a gas station threatens oil profits. A beer that transmits electricity without wires threatens the meter. A house that heats itself from underground threatens utility revenue. A village powered by its own stream threatens centralized billing. And a solar panel shared by neighbors threatens the idea that energy must be owned by someone else. The opposition never says, "This works too well." It says, "It's unprofitable," or "It's not scalable," or "It's a regulatory risk." But behind each phrase is a simple truth. These ideas shift power, literally and figuratively, and that scares people who hold it. This isn't just a tale of what was lost. It's a mirror held up to our present. Because many of these technologies still exist, still function, still whisper a different kind of future. A future where energy is not just cleaner, but fairer. Not just cheaper, but shared. Not just safer, but freeing. We like to believe that progress is linear, that better ideas always win. But history suggests otherwise. Sometimes better ideas are delayed. Not because we weren't ready, but because someone else wasn't willing. So the question isn't, could we have had a different energy future? It's, are we brave enough now to build it anyway? Step back and trace the shape of it. 10 stories, different on the surface, but eerily similar underneath. Each technology promised a new kind of freedom, a way to unhook from monthly bills, to generate what you need where you are, to bypass the gatekeepers. And each one, at the critical moment, was stopped. A reactor that shut itself down without human intervention. A city heated by water rising freely from the ground, water pulled from the air. A car that didn't need oil. A reactor that couldn't be weaponized. Fuel from a plant. Electricity from the tides. Wireless global power. Solar shared among neighbors. Streams turned into power stations for farms. 10 different answers to 10 pressing problems, and every one of them muted when they became too effective. That's not coincidence. That's design. We live inside systems shaped less by possibility and more by permission. Less by what works and more by what can be monetized. In this world, energy isn't a right, it's a product. And any technology that disrupts that product model doesn't just fail, it's made to fail. But the truth is harder to suppress than any machine. It surfaces in archived footage of a car being crushed, in a rusting pipe still carrying heat under Boise, in the strange glow of a test reactor that never harmed a soul, in old patents, in stored blueprints, in engineers who remember, in citizens who still ask, and now, perhaps, in us. Because buried technology is not gone, and neither is the dream. Every one of these inventions points to a truth we often forget. Scarcity isn't always natural. Sometimes it's enforced, by law, by bureaucracy, by design. And if scarcity can be created, so can abundance. So what would it take to resurrect these ideas, not as nostalgia but as action? Community organizing, local policy changes, open source designs, independent investment? It won't be easy. The forces that suppress these breakthroughs haven't gone away, but neither have the needs they were meant to address. The cost of energy continues to rise, the planet continues to warm, and the future continues to call. Each of these technologies is a seed, not dead, dormant, and perhaps now, in an age of climate urgency and digital connection, we can plant them again, share the knowledge, rebuild the prototypes, push back against the machinery of delay. The real question isn't whether these technologies work, it's whether we do. What if the next revolution isn't technical at all, but personal? What if the greatest source of power isn't a machine, but the willingness to challenge what we've been told is impossible? So where does that leave us? 10 technologies, 10 chapters of human ingenuity, all halted not by failure, but by success that threatened the wrong interests. Together, they sketch a blueprint for a world we never got, one powered by clean abundance, shaped by local autonomy, and guided by long-term thinking over short-term profit. But this story isn't just about energy. It's about memory, and what we choose to forget. The integral fast reactor could have made meltdowns a thing of the past. Tesla's tower might have upended how power flows. Hemp could have rewritten the rules of fuel and fiber. Community solar showed that neighbors could become power producers. Small dams proved that energy independence was once normal. Yet instead of scaling those breakthroughs, we scaled the systems that buried them. There's a quiet grief in that realization, but also a quiet hope. Because every one of these ideas still flickers, on a page, in a lab, in a backyard project, in a forgotten blueprint. They haven't disappeared. They've simply been paused, waiting for us to press play again. We're told that energy must be scarce, that it must come with a bill, that it must be owned, metered, controlled. But these stories say otherwise. They remind us that abundance is not a fantasy, it's a choice. And while the systems that block these breakthroughs are powerful, they are not permanent. We can write new codes, pass new policies, fund new experiments, build new networks. We can remember, and remembering is powerful because it invites us to reimagine, to see not just what is, but what could have been and still might be. Cheap, clean energy isn't a dream. It's a buried reality, one we already touched, one we already proved. The future doesn't have to be a continuation of the present. It can be a correction, a return, a renewal. And maybe one day when someone asks why we ever accepted pollution, scarcity, and endless bills as normal, we'll point back to this moment, to the rediscovery of what we always had, to the people who chose to dig it back up, and to the quiet but enduring truth that the energy crisis wasn't a lack of power, it was a lack of permission. Until now.